Good morning and welcome to Ukraine's National Security on Trial. My name is Melinda Herring and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Today, we aim to shine a light on an important issue in Ukraine that hasn't received enough attention. When Ukrainian retired Major General Viktor Nazarov was acting Chief of Operations of the anti-terrorist effort in the Donbas, he was accused of negligence in connection with the shoot-down by Russian-led forces of a Ukrainian Il-76 transport plane on June 17, 2014, with the loss of 9 flight crew members and 40 paratroopers. On December 11, 2020, a civil appellate court reviewed the trial and upheld the conviction. On December 23rd, the Supreme Court of Ukraine issued a stay in Nazarov's incarceration. Even if Nazarov is ultimately exonerated, the structural issues that produce the civilian criminalization of combatant command decisions remain, and this is a problem. Dr. Philip Carver, president of the Potomac Foundation and a former strategic advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, studied this case and are deeply worried about its implications. Dr. Carver, Ambassador John Herbst, and Victor Rood gathered top experts on U.S. national security and Ukraine to explain their concerns in a statement that we are releasing now. That statement of concern has been signed by 16 people, many of whom are on this call. Thank you for joining us. My colleagues will paste a link to that statement in the chat function now. Dr. Carver, now I'd like to ask you to outline the case in more detail. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Melinda. I'd like to explain the military situation at the time the command was relayed to General Nazarov to organize the aerial resupply of paratroops at Luhansk Airport. I believe these facts are important because they were noticeably left out of his trial. First, the Battle of Ukraine's airports was of strategic importance. Kramatorsk was surrounded for 81 days. Everyone remembers the valiant stand of the cyborgs at Donetsk. But Luhansk, just 30 kilometers from the Russian border, was an extremely exposed position. Second, the troops at Luhansk Airport were surrounded and did not have land access for resupply, reinforcement, or even removal of wounded. This is not the first time in history of warfare that a situation like this has occurred. In 1942, Stalingrad, 488 planes shot down with the loss of 1,100 crewmen trying to resupply. 1944, Allied Airborne Operation Market Garden, 36 planes shot down trying to help the British paratroops in Arnhem. 1954, Battle of Dien Bien Phu, surrounded French paratroops. 62 aircraft lost, 167 damaged. 1968, Battle of Khe Sanh, besieged Marines. In a situation almost identical to that at Luhansk, a transport hit by ground fire on approach was destroyed in flight, killing all 40 crew and troops on board. In none of these cases were any commanders or operations officers accused, let alone tried for negligence. And oh, by the way, prior to the shootdown, 17 aircraft had previously made the trip safely to Luhansk. Third, regarding advanced intelligence, the primary accusation against Nazarov is ignoring rumors that insurgents were being armed with surface-to-air missiles in the Luhansk area. We now know from veterans of the Wagner Group that the shootdown was actually conducted by a specialist Wagner team inserted just a few days before with manpads that did the firing, not the local insurgents, who claimed credit and served as cover for the professional mercenary operators who actually did the downing. That means that the rumored intelligence of threat from locals was not treated negligently, and neither Nazarov nor any other Ukrainian should be held accountable for dismissing what they did not know. There's only one party that could rightly be accused of the shoot down of the airplane, and that's Russia. Looking for internal culprits only masks that responsibility. There are many professions that ask people to put their lives at risk: firemen, policemen, medical staffs in the current pandemic. But what is not generally understood is that the military is the only profession where its practitioners, combat commanders at every level, are expected, indeed demanded, to put those in their charge at risk of their lives. Every decision made by a commander at any level in the heat of battle can be deconstructed after the fact by those who have the luxury of ex post facto perfect knowledge, not being pressured by time and limited resources, nor confronted by opposing forces actively trying to deceive and destroy them. Retrospective analysis of past operations is important. Lessons need to be learned from previous mistakes for future success. But exploiting that backward look to find blame, let alone criminalize practitioners before a civilian court professionally incapable of assessing military necessity, is not only unfair, but ultimately self-defeating. My colleagues with extensive command experience and leadership in NATO can explain better than I why this is the ruin of any military and inhibiting to allied support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carver. That was a cogent description of the case. Now it's my pleasure and honor to welcome 4 other signatories here to speak. Welcome to General Philip Breedlove, a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology and the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Welcome to General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Welcome to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. And welcome finally to Ambassadors Sandy Vershbaugh, a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, the former NATO Deputy Secretary General, and a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. As you can see, we have quite a distinguished panel, and I'm going to give them as much time as possible. Gentlemen, you each have 3 minutes to make your opening statements. General Breedlove, the floor is yours, sir.
Well, good morning to all, and thank you for being here. This is important work, and this is something we need to get right in a country and for a country that we all have been fighting for some years now. My fear that this great country of Ukraine is that they will get out of step with those in the West who want to support her. As you've already heard said, the military places very different requirements on its soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and their leaders. We take and we require risks. We know that lives will be lost, and every life is precious, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families that lost loved ones here. But as commanders, we know these risks and understand what these losses mean, and we care more than most know. I cringe when people talk about commanders and generals that want to go to war. Frankly, we're the last that want to do that. It's hard for others to understand, I know. History is full of examples that aligned perfectly with the things that we're considering in this case. You just heard Dr. Carver talk about Market Garden, the French at Dien Bien Phu, Khe Sanh, the US in Baghdad. And those are incredible examples, but even think about the other times that commanders put our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines at risk. The first SACEUR, General Clark and my first predecessor, when he had to make the decision to go ashore in D-Day, he knew that if it went right, if his decision was right, tens of thousands were going to die. He also knew that if he didn't make a decision, or if he made the wrong decision, history would probably change. We need to remember what these decisions mean to not only our soldiers, but to our countries. Militaries who are faced with decision paralysis brought on by decisions like we fear are being made here will fail. No decision is a decision. No decision equals a loss of life and probably a loss of mission. Commanders have to decide and move forward. I urge us all to see the importance of what we're talking about today and the precedents that could be set. And I agree completely with Dr. Carver's closing remarks. We need to keep the focus here on who is really responsible for this, and that is the Russians and their proxies, such as the Wagner Group and others. Keep the focus there and stay aligned with the rest of the countries of the West. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak this morning.
Thank you, General Breedlove. Now I'd like to turn it over to General Clark. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. I was there with Dr. Carver in the early days after Maidan. We actually walked through Maidan. We talked to the people who were there. We saw the bullets embedded in the lampposts. We understood the pain of the Ukrainian people. We met with the men and women who were putting their lives on the line to try to maintain the independence of Ukraine. I made several trips back. I watched the emergence of the Ukrainian armed forces. What's happened to General Nazarov is absolutely unfair, unjustified, and very destructive of Ukraine's future and its alignment with the West. In military operations, commanders are given missions. They must always weigh the mission versus the risk. Can the mission be accomplished? Can it be accomplished without undue risk to the men and women under their command? Does the value of the mission justify the risk to the men and women under their command? These are the decisions that weigh on military commanders. I was a commander of NATO forces when we intervened to stop Serb ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. For every mission, we evaluated the risks involved. Those responsibilities were on my shoulders. And I knew that if I failed, I'd be judged by my military judgment, by other military men and women who had understanding of the situation, the constraints and restraints, the mission given, the capabilities of the forces, and so on. Never did I think that some event could cause a civilian jury to look at military judgment, so long as I stayed within the bounds of international law in my actions. General Nazarov was fully operating, by all reports, within the bounds of professional military judgment. He made the best decision he could based on the information available at the time. In retrospect, sure, that flight may not should not have gone. If you had known it was going to be shot down, of course you wouldn't send it. But you can't know those things in advance. This is the fundamental issue that has to be addressed by the Ukraine system of justice. Assess and judge military professionals by other military professionals who understand and can effectively and correctly evaluate the mission, the risks, the circumstances, and pass judgment. That's not been done in the case of General Nazarov. I think they've got to fix this system in Ukraine. It's important for the morale and welfare of the armed forces of Ukraine, and it's important for Ukraine itself. Ukraine is strategically important to the West. Many of us have our hearts set on Ukraine becoming a fully integrated member of NATO. We want you with us. If you want to be with us as we want you, you've got to bring your systems in line. You've got to treat these military decisions with the respect, with the understanding that they always involve trade-offs and risks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General Clark. Those were very moving remarks and spot on. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, it's your turn, sir.
Linda, thank you. First, let me say that I am, or to send my condolences and sympathy to the families who lost a soldier in this terrible incident, as well as others who have been lost in the fighting in Donbas. It is important, though, to keep in mind that this plane was shot down by Russian-led forces. That is who is responsible for the death of these soldiers. That's who's responsible for the shoot down of this aircraft. And in fact, that's who's responsible for all of the deaths in the Donbas. And it could be stopped in one day if the Kremlin chose to do it. So like General Breedlove said, let's keep the focus on what this is all about. The second point, it is time to ensure that the state protects those soldiers who are protecting the state. That means you need a military justice system that provides for good order and discipline in all the armed forces. It means that the state must provide clear guidance and the correct legal basis within which soldiers are expected to operate, to fight. And that means the state must provide training and education to make sure that everybody understands what that legal basis is, what the expectations are, versus sending soldiers out into situations where the legal basis is unclear or for which they may be charged or prosecuted later. This is the responsibility of the state to protect people who are protecting the state. The third point, the nature of war. We know from 5,000 years of military history that warfare, no matter how much technology there is the domain of fog, friction, uncertainty, and that there is an enemy trying to exploit all of those aspects of the nature of war. And we also know from centuries of military history that soldiers must operate and fight effectively inside these kinds of conditions, which requires that they be willing to accept risk and to act in conditions of uncertainty, exactly as General Clark described. And that's at every level, from the 4-star level down to the level of the sergeant. And we know that mistakes are going to happen. But if we punish every soldier that ever makes a mistake, then the human response will be that soldiers will not make a mistake. They will not do anything because they don't want to make a mistake. And then when you start killing initiative, then you guarantee mission failure and even more casualties. So the conditions have to encourage leaders, reward leaders actually for using initiative and taking risks with imperfect information if you want a military that is capable of protecting the state. The fourth and final point, and this is also linked to what General Clark has said, we have a new administration in the United States that will come in 10 days, in 9 days. They're going to be developing a strategy for the Black Sea region. Ukraine is key to that strategy. So the United States government and the US Congress will look closely at the effectiveness, the stability, and the professionalism of Ukraine's armed forces and the institutions that undergird Ukrainian armed forces. Fixing this situation is an important part of that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Ambassador Vershbaugh, your turn, please, sir.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. And thanks for the opportunity to offer a non-military perspective based on my experience as a diplomat, as a civilian official at the Pentagon, and as a senior NATO official as well. First, I'd like to thank Phil Carver and Ben Hodges for bringing the tragic events of June 2014 to a wider audience. And thanks to them and my former NATO colleagues, Wes Clark and Phil Breedlove, for explaining the serious implications of the case against General Nazarov. As you may know, I was NATO Deputy Secretary General at the start of Russia's aggression against Ukraine in early 2014, when Ukraine's survival as an independent state was hanging by a thread. That was a frightening time for all of us who care about European security. And I understand why the IL-76 shootdown is such a sensitive and emotional issue for the Ukrainian people up until the present day. And I also want to express my condolences to the families who lost their loved ones in this tragedy and in many other needless battles in the war in Donbas. Now, my colleagues have made a compelling case for why it is not only unfair to criminalize the decisions of commanders like General Nazarov taken in the heat of battle, but why it will be damaging to Ukraine's national security in the longer term. I agree with their argument that such a policy will discourage other Ukrainian commanders from making tough decisions and lead them to be overly cautious, reluctant to take the initiative. When Ukraine is up against direct aggression and hybrid warfare from a rogue superpower that violates the laws of war without any hesitation, indecision or inertia could be fatal. In the United States and other countries, as my colleagues have said, we insist on civilian control of the military, but we expect our commanders to be able to make difficult decisions under fire in situations that are almost always clouded by uncertainties about enemy capabilities, by limited intelligence, and by the fog of war. We trust them to carefully weigh the risks of different options, including the risks of inaction but ultimately to do what they think is best for the interests of their nation and for the men and women under their command. If commanders must worry about being prosecuted in civilian courts for decisions that don't work out, they will go out of their way to avoid making mistakes and shrink from risky courses of action, which is more likely than not to lead to defeat and greater losses on the battlefield. Now, in the present case, scapegoating a highly professional commander like General Nazarov, who did his best to protect the troops facing annihilation in the battle for Luhansk airport, is also politically counterproductive. By criminalizing General Nazarov's actions, Ukrainian authorities have taken the spotlight off of the real culprit, the Russian Federation, and the troops under its control, allowing Moscow to evade responsibility for the deaths of 49 Ukrainian citizens. This only plays into the hands of Russian propagandists who seek to portray Ukraine as hopelessly divided and a failed state. Now, Ukrainians need to consider the negative consequences of the current approach for their aspirations for NATO membership and their efforts to meet NATO standards. There's no single model within NATO, no single standard for how to organize your military justice system. Some NATO countries rely on military courts martial like the United States. Others have mixed military-civilian systems. But if Ukraine expects to be admitted to NATO, allies will want to be sure that its military justice system, however it's organized, is insulated from politics, ensures judicial independence and impartiality, and meets the highest standards of fairness and due process, which means judges and juries with operational military experience. Now, I know the Nazarov case is complicated by the fact that Ukraine was not officially at war with Russia at the time of the IL-76 tragedy. Until 2018, the conflict was treated as an anti-terrorist operation. Hopefully, there's now greater legal clarity for Ukrainian servicemen and women. But regardless of the legal ambiguities at the time, there are enduring issues that my colleagues and I have tried to highlight today. And I hope that Ukrainian leaders and politicians will seriously consider the recommendations in our statement of concern. We appeal to Ukraine's leaders not to let the Nazarov case become a precedent for the treatment of other Ukrainian commanders who have made and will continue to make equally tough decisions in difficult circumstances until the Donbas conflict is finally brought to an end and its territory is restored to Ukrainian sovereignty. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Berchbaugh, for that very comprehensive and excellent closer. Now, we have about 38 minutes to ask questions to these five gentlemen. This is a press conference. We welcome your questions. We have more than 100 people, so to make this orderly, I'm going to ask you to go down to the Q&A and please type your question. I will identify you. If you're a member of the press, I will ask your question first. And if you would like to direct it at one of our five gentlemen, feel free. The first question is from a gentleman named Andrei Duda. He says, comment and question from Lieutenant General with the Ukrainian Air Force. He says, first of all, thank you for your joint public statement in support of General Viktor Nazarov at such a stormy time for the United States. The Officers Corps of Ukraine appreciates it and is grateful for your solidarity. What else would you recommend to do to restore faith and justice, especially among young Ukrainian officers? Who would like to take that first? General Clark, would you like to take a stab at that one?
I would. I'd like to take that. First of all, the conviction against General Nazarov must be set aside. Secondly, there needs to be a statement of principles about the future direction of military justice in Ukraine, how it will be handled in accordance with the principles set out by Ambassador Berchbaugh. And third, I think the political leaders in Ukraine, the Minister of Defense and the President, his Chief of Staff, need to give the assurances to the men and women who are serving in positions of leadership in Ukraine that their judgment is respected, their courage is respected, their professionalism is respected, and they're expected to make the tough decisions, trading off mission versus the men, taking the appropriate risks to accomplish the missions to keep Ukraine safe, to maintain its independence, and to preserve its national sovereignty.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. General Breedlove, any more comments on that question?
I think I could not add it all to General Clark's wonderful high-level piece here. What I would say to this Lieutenant General is don't lose faith. Your job is to lead your airmen, or if you're in a joint command, your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And you need to lead them the way you have been trained, and that will require you to take risks, and do not be discouraged or disheartened by this process, but continue to lead with courage and conviction.
Wonderful, thank you. Lieutenant General Hodges, your turn, sir.
Yeah, I would like to respond to this. It really was from General Holopatuk, an experienced soldier of Ukrainian armed forces himself. I think at the tactical level, Ukrainian armed forces should be doing everything they can to encourage and reward leaders who are willing to accept huge risks, the ones who demonstrate the moral courage as well as the physical courage in these conditions of uncertainty. The young leaders who stopped the Russian forces, by the way, everybody should remember that, yes, we still have Russians sitting in Donbas, but it was Ukrainian armed forces that stopped them. And so those young leaders are the ones, and every one of them will have made a mistake somewhere because they're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, but those are the ones that should be rewarded and held up as examples. Everybody that General Breedlove and General Clark and I studied since we were very young cadets a long time ago, the examples that were always held up for us were military leaders who took the biggest risks, who made the toughest decisions in the worst conditions. But that's who we grew up respecting and trying to emulate. That was the example that was held up, because we know from thousands of years of military history, that's what's required, that bold leadership. So Ukraine has got to make sure you develop and protect a culture where people are expected to do that.
Wonderful, that's an important point. Dr. Carver, go ahead, sir.
You know, I'd like to point out that Ukraine has a perfect example. In the summer of 2014, then Colonel, now General Zabrowski, did the famous raid, breaking through the lines and to rescue thousands of Ukrainian troops surrounded along the border. Now, as an operation of enormous risk. Back when I interviewed him, he said, it's like operating in an icebreaker. As you move forward, the ice seals behind you. They were literally cut off as he drove to the border to rescue these guys. In this case, it succeeded. Several thousand Ukrainian soldiers are now home and safe because of his taking that risk. And he rightly got Hero of Ukraine recognition. But he's the first person to tell you that that was not at all certain. In fact, the outcome was highly in doubt. Now, ask oneself, with the Nazarov example, would a future Zabrowski take that risk? And if not, what are the consequences? So I think it's important. Ukraine, which I stress this, is there are numerous examples I could give of Ukrainian officers doing the right thing. And my fear, and I think the fear of all of us, is that future officers will be inhibited. And those of us in the West who would want to put our troops in a situation where commanders are inhibited to doing the right thing.
Thank you, sir. Another question from a Ukrainian Major General, and he says, thank you so much to all of you for putting this together. And he says that he has worked with General Nazarov personally. He served under him, and he says, I can say with confidence that he is one of the most trained and experienced generals in the armed forces of Ukraine, and I cannot agree with the charges against him. His question, I think this is probably to Alexander Vershbow. My question is, will the court's decision against General Nazarov have consequences in terms of military assistance from our Western partners to Ukraine? Ambassador Vershbow?
Yes, that's a good question. And obviously, no one can be sure how it will impact military assistance, but there is a risk that this will alienate some of Ukraine's strongest supporters in the US Congress, the Friends of Ukraine among the general public. And I think it will be viewed in the broader context of Ukraine's reform efforts, its efforts to establish a truly law-based state, including the civilian justice system as well as the military justice system. There's been a lot of concern, particularly since the sacking of a lot of the cabinet back in March of last year, about the negative trends when it comes to the rule of law in Ukraine. So I think this would just be another factor that could undermine the political base for support for continued military assistance to Ukraine. With a new administration coming into office in less than 10 days, that would be particularly unfortunate if the new administration, which is clearly committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, had good reason to hesitate in providing the kind of support that Ukraine continues to need. And it would undermine efforts to rally other allies within NATO to step up and do more to support Ukraine as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Vershbow. General Breedlove, please.
Yeah, just two minor points too, and I'm sure General Clark had some of the same experiences. But as we built forces for doing things in Afghanistan and Kosovo and other places, and you're encouraging other nations to become a part of your effort, whether they be allies or non-allies, I see two problems that could grow from this. Would other nations want their soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to serve under a Ukrainian command when that commander's decision-making authority or ability is affected by not wanting to have a mistake and then come under civilian criminalization of their combatant decisions? And secondarily, would they want to come into a system where they, as a serving from another nation, but in a conflict in Ukraine or supporting a Ukrainian commander, that their commanders or their troops might come under the same sort of scrutiny? These are things that I think would be a calculus that would negatively affect some of our allies and partners serving alongside their Ukrainian brothers and sisters.
Thank you very much. Dmitry Shurko from the National News of Ukraine has a question, and I think this is best directed at General Breedlove, General Clark, and Lieutenant General Hodges. Gentlemen, we have seen how the Ukrainian armed forces and their morale were increasing. You've observed their courage under fire. I'm sorry, the question just jumped down. The questions are coming in. What kind of influence would a court decision have on the soldiers' morale? And is there a balance between a court decision and the moral reaction on the side of Ukrainian society? I'm going to start with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges and then go to General Clark and then General Breedlove. Go ahead, sir.
So the soldiers of Ukrainian armed forces deserve competent, courageous leadership. I think soldiers will forgive their leaders, especially young leaders. They'll forgive them of most mistakes because they know a young officer is learning how to lead in these conditions, but they'll never forgive cowardice. And so I think what we want to make sure is that court decisions, especially when they are correctly in the military institution, professional military prosecutors and defenders, a decision from them would actually give soldiers confidence that the system will protect them and will demand competence. What doesn't help them is when it comes from a court that's frankly not qualified, or as we know, there are some prosecutors, civilian prosecutors out there that are charging thousands of Ukrainian soldiers for various crimes in the expectation of getting a bribe to drop the charge.
Thank you, sir. General Clark, any other thoughts?
Yes, one of the oldest ailments of armed forces is the fear of the soldier or airman that's on the front line, that he doesn't have support and understanding from the rear. And it leads to a feeling of they've neglected me. They don't care about me. Why am I out here serving and sacrificing, risking my life and my future for people who don't care? This kind of decision made against General Nazarov spreads all those fears in the armed forces. In the United States Army, from the time I came in, and I'm sure that my colleagues felt the same way, we always knew we had the support of the chain of command through a very well-structured and respected system of military justice. We knew that if we made a mistake, we'd be evaluated by our colleagues. And we knew behind that was the force of law of the United States of America. Ukraine owes it to the young men and women who are serving and sacrificing in their armed forces to establish such a system and to be cognizant of the impact of the failure to establish such a system and the adverse consequences it could have for Ukraine's future.
Thank you, sir. General Breedlove?
Let me just echo that. That was my first reaction. I couldn't have said it so eloquently, but let me echo General Clark's remark. Let me also add that in a sense of morale, as a young airman, I wanted to look up and see leaders who had experience, who were confident, who could make decisions, and I knew could lead me to battle in a way that left confidence in me. And I think that this is an important matter here. The Ukrainian soldiers need to be able to look up and know that they have commanders who have lived where they have lived, done what they have done, and can make decisions that they know will take care of them, but most importantly, accomplish the mission. And I think that's in the balance here a bit. We cannot create an atmosphere in this country that ties the hands of the commanders who lead our troops.
Wonderful, thank you. So Major General Viktor Nazarov is actually with us on this call, and he says, I'd like to express my gratitude for your support and the good explanation of the nature of war. Thank you so much for being with us, General Nazarov. Question, I believe, to Ambassador Vershba. Go ahead, Dr. Carter, please.
May I make a comment? I spent many hours interviewing General Nazarov at the request of General H.R. McMaster, who was running the U.S. Army's Russian New Generation Warfare Study, and had asked me to serve as a liaison with the General Staff. In all those hours, I never found someone who was more professional, who had an incredible memory and detail about of battles that I witnessed and others, and who was bluntly honest in terms of mistakes and so forth, and candid. By the way, in all those hours, in 15, 16 that I spent with him, he never once mentioned the charges. I didn't realize that he was even being charged until later. And I think it's to his honor that when asked, would he take a pardon, he said no, because that would mean he was admitting guilt. He is the consummate professional, from my personal experience, he's the consummate professional officer of the highest order. And any NATO country, I remember reporting General McMaster going, any of us, any NATO country would be proud to have a man such as he in our operations staff. I just want to emphasize that the man is extremely humble. I would also like to point out, having had my own child, a son killed, General Nazarov also lost a child. He understands the anguish that parents feel with the loss of the children. This is not a hardened military guy who throws people to the dumpster. Unfortunately, he's been enormously demonized in the process. I just wanted to emphasize on a personal level my enormous personal respect for him.
Thank you, Dr. Carver. Very, very timely remark. A question now to Ambassador Vershba. We have 20 minutes remaining, so I'm going to ask you all to shorten your responses just a little bit. This is from our good friend Anatoly Gritsenko. Happy New Year, Mr. Gritsenko. Thank you for joining us. Do you believe that the timely declaration of the state of war by the president at that time would have established clearer lines of responsibility and rules of engagement to avoid such court accusations for the military?
Well, it's quite possible that with clearer lines of authority, a clearer chain of command than was in fact the case during the anti-terrorist operation. There might have been a more efficient conduct of the operation. But it's hard to say. I'm not so sure we can make any real judgment on that, because it was early in the battle. Ukraine's armed forces and its security institutions writ large were barely functioning when the Russian aggression was launched. And there was, of course, a demoralization out of the quick illegal annexation of Crimea. So it was a tough situation. I think after the fact, the legal implications might have been easier to ascertain had this already been clearly established as a military conflict rather than an anti-terrorist operation, with the military chain of command rather than the State Security Bureau being in charge. But again, I think the key is now, since 2018, there is legal clarity, or greater legal clarity, and hopefully addressing this issue is avoiding the civilian prosecution issue that we've been talking about will create a more stable environment where the soldiers and the commanders know where they stand and will take the initiative, take the tough decisions that they're going to have to take as long as the Russian aggression doesn't show any signs of abating.
Thank you, Ambassador Vershbaugh. This is a question for Dr. Carber and anyone else. Just give me a two-finger if you want to jump in. Is there any reaction from the Ukrainian political leadership so far? If not, why so?
I think President Zelenskyy has, to my understanding, recognized this issue and requested that the Minister of Defense and Chief of General Staff, Ruslan Umchak, to conduct a review of it. And the Supreme Court did put a stay in terms of stopping the immediate imprisonment of General Nazarov. So yes, I think there is some reaction. Where it comes out, I think it depends on how, this is my personal opinion, it depends on how serious they take this issue. If people had been paying attention, they would have done it, they would have fixed this a long time ago. But it's never too late. It's never too late. In fact, it is very late, but definitely fixable now. So I think hopefully this administration will, in Ukraine, will take the initiative and solve not just the Nazarov issue, but as said by my colleagues, the structural issues. Let me add, it's easy to demonize. So I've seen people say, "Oh, blame it on Poroshenko." Well, Poroshenko had been in office for 3 weeks when this event happened. When he initiated on July 4th the attempt to clear out the parts of the Donbas, by the way, which freed about half of the Donbas, the U.S. government at that time said, "Well, we would prefer them not to take escalation, but we understand." The White House said that. There was enormous pressure from Berlin, from Washington, and others, but particularly those two, on the Ukrainian leadership to not do anything provocative, and so I encourage people to study the past, but don't demonize the past, and don't demonize those who had to make tough decisions. Would it have been best to have had a declaration of national emergency, which the Russians would have declared, treated as a declaration of war? And you go, and Putin would have said, "Hey, Ukraine declared war on me. Okay, let's go." In this hybrid new generation war, it's a very challenging thing. And the Russians play it like a Stradivarius. So I think it's very important to recognize that for the future, but not turn around and demonize everybody in the past. They were making difficult decisions under very extreme difficult positions.
Thank you, Dr. Carber. General Clark, go ahead, please.
2 obvious points. First, I'd like to say to the people of Ukraine that all of us express our condolences for the losses and admiration for the sacrifices. And we hope that this discussion today, our collective experiences, our expressions of hope for the future, of how professional judgment should be made, our understanding of the situation there will help the leadership in Ukraine to make the right decisions in these cases and in moving forward. We want the Ukrainian public to understand that we sympathize with the losses and the terrible cost the conflicts brought to bear on Ukraine. But we want the leadership to understand that we have to set the system straight in moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Question for Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Sir, are there other similar cases that are working their way through the courts or accusations of similar cases?
So there's no other cases that are so high profile as General Nazarov. However, there have been many cases, in fact, thousands of cases where soldiers, border guards, and others have been charged. One that was particularly notorious, I will say, was for a border guard soldier named Kolmogorov. He, along with about 8 other soldiers near Mariupol, were at a checkpoint, and a car drove through the checkpoint, didn't stop. The soldiers ended up shooting at the car. A woman inside the car, passenger, ended up being killed. Civilian prosecutor took on the case and charged all of them with premeditated murder. All the other members of the squad allegedly were able to get out from underneath these charges because they were able to pay the prosecutor. Our good soldier Kolmogorov chose not to do that, and in fact was sentenced to 13 years for premeditated murder. Fortunately, that case has been thrown out. But the fact is, you've got, you don't have the institution of military justice that we enjoy in the United States and in most other Western European countries, where the rules are clear and soldiers are protected. And I think this is important that the institutional part is fixed. I can tell you, we had hundreds of cases in Iraq and Afghanistan where civilian cars drive through checkpoints at night because they don't understand, they don't see, and it puts soldiers in a very, very dangerous situation because there were so many car bombs that were being used in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It is very difficult, and that's why the rules and the structure have got to be fixed to protect these soldiers who are protecting the state.
Thank you so much. There's another thank you that I'd like to read out. Former Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Viktor Nazarov, also expresses his deep respect to all the participants of this press conference and says, thank you very much, gentlemen. A next question I have is from Alexei Sorokin with the Kiev Post. He would like to ask a question on accountability. What should be the appropriate process to assess the possible negligence by soldiers and military officers for the downing of the flight? What's your take on the ongoing prosecutor's office reform and the shutdown of the military prosecutor? General Breedlove, I'm going to let you go first.
So rather than speak to the specifics of what he's asking, I think that there are lots of opportunity, and there are other questions in the Q&A about how we can help, we, NATO, the West, can help Ukraine to develop those processes, those offices, those laws that bring them more in line with the West, where, as was described by General Clark and others, we would have a system to look at these issues that is not only adheres to civil tenets of the law, but are meted out and examined by people with military experience. And so I think that's one of the real heart of the matter here, is that this has to be looked at in light of what the military mission, as has been described, is, and what the military mission requires of its commanders and its soldiers. And I do believe that there are lots of opportunities. You know, we formed a wonderful coalition for training at Yavriv and other places where we're sharing and learning from each other and teaching each other. I believe there is opportunity to do that in the legal sphere as well, to bring this in line with what we're all asking for to change about this, the way this has been looked at.
I'd like to make
Melinda, would you reread the first part of that question?
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me reread it. The question is, what should be the appropriate process to assess the possible negligence by soldiers and military officers? I'm gonna let General Clark go, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Carver. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So in this specific incident, obviously the accountability rests with Russia, who sent in the Wagner team mercenaries in an undisclosed assault on Ukraine that they have continued to deny their responsibility for. And all public approbation should be directed at Russia. Insofar as General Nazarov is concerned, then an appropriate group of military leaders could evaluate that, but has been explained by Dr. Carver and all the rest of us on this call. These are circumstances of measuring the risk against the mission accomplishment. It's been taken by leaders for generations. And in almost every case, what happens is that you say this is a terrible risk, and yes, there were losses, but at the time, no one could have anticipated that particular loss or taken action to have prevented it. And the decision was appropriate. And I can tell you just from everything I've read about this case, that would be the judgment of the military professionals in this case.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Carver?
So the prosecutor is not competent to address the issue of negligence. In fact, the whole issue of negligence to me is a red herring because it implies that if untoward things happen from making a tough command decision under uncertainty, then it's de facto negligent. That's crazy. During the trial, which was a circus, there's not a country in the West that would have allowed their military guys to be put under in this environment where people are yelling and screaming. There's no one addressing the military context. To bring in outside experts and sociologists and everybody else to opine on stuff and ignore the military realities. It was an absolute farce, and it's time people recognize it. The issue of negligence is extremely problematic because it presumes that ex post facto you can look and say, oh well, we would have been able to he should have, he could have, would have, and as everybody, my colleagues are all stressed. Timely decisions by far drive successful results, not decisiophobia, the fear of making a decision. And that's exactly what's been put here.
Thank you so much. Any other gentlemen want to jump in? No? Okay, great. Next question is to General Clark. This is from Andrei Zagornyuk, who's the former defense minister. He says, thank you for organizing this very insightful conference. One problem is that Ukrainian law practically does not regulate the responsibility of the commanders for combat losses, which is a serious problem. Making court decisions without considering the realities of war provides a grave precedent, which you've outlined. Ukraine has no presidential history to develop the law properly. Soviet experiences are irrelevant due to many reasons. So perhaps NATO countries' experience would be most relevant, which would be a big step up for Ukrainian courts to include. Do you believe NATO countries can help in sharing either case law, or could you point to any cases that are relevant, sir?
Well, it's an excellent question. Thank you, Minister Zagorodnik. And yes, NATO countries can be helpful And I'm sure that that NATO countries will attempt to be helpful in this case now that it's been brought up to this level of attention. I'm sure we'll get the outreach that's necessary for helping in Ukraine. And I'd like to ask Ambassador Hirschfeld if he'd like to come in on that.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I agree that this is an area where NATO countries, I'm sure, could share their experience and provide ideas to the Ukrainian counterparts on how to reform the military justice system. Rooting out corruption, as General Hodges has mentioned, of course, is going to be a prerequisite to any successful reform. But I think avoiding using terms like negligence, which can be easily abused, and ensuring that basic standards are institutionalized in the system, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, in terms of judicial independence, impartiality, and due process, with military expertise very much present both in the judges and in the juries that address these kinds of cases. But I think that NATO does a lot on the broader issue of civil-military relations. Perhaps this could be a new area of emphasis in the cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, in addition to the sort of the hard assistance to military capabilities and training that, of course, is indispensable while the war continues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Hirschfeld. Last question. I'm going to send this one to General Breedlove and Lieutenant General Hodges. How might General Nazarov's case affect leadership training of future officers, and how can we mitigate this risk during the training of our cadets? General Breedlove?
So I think actually this question has already been addressed several times. And the first impact would be a negative impact. If we have training systems that look up and see what happens in a case like this if it's not reversed or changed, I believe that those systems will be negatively impacted because young soldiers will be risk averse and they will be decision averse. I can't do that famous word that Phil Carver used. But the fact of the matter is, we've said, multiple of us have said, our young commanders need to understand that they have responsibility, authority, and accountability, and they can make decisions in that framework and lead their troops. And that's what needs to be taught in the training of our young people.
So I would just like to add that the training institutions for cadets and young officers and even sergeants of Ukrainian armed forces have got to be designed to encourage decision-making. And soldiers have to have multiple opportunities to practice making decisions. I was in the Army for almost 38 years. I made every non-criminal mistake you could possibly make over those 38 years at every level. And I was always protected by people like General Breedlove, and then going all the way back to my 1st battalion commander, who would apply corrective action to me, but then would turn it into a learning experience. And there's nothing worse than getting your ass chewed by a 4-star. That's pretty serious. But I would also say that my favorite, and I thought the most effective training events, were when you had scenarios based on case studies of actual events, and then and they were sanitized without the names on it. And then you would talk about, what would you do in this case? And you sit around and discuss it, and then you find out the rest of the story. Well, this actually happened, and it was by Colonel so-and-so or Captain so-and-so. And that really brings home to young leaders what they're in for, the kind of environment and conditions and unbelievable missions they're going to have that are so much more challenging than the normal training environment. And also what the expectation is, that you will be expected to be successful in these conditions, even though guarantee you will never have enough resources to do them. You're still going to be expected to be successful.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank my 5 distinguished panelists here today. I'd also like to recognize Miroslava Luzhinina for her leadership with this, Victor Rudd, and Ambassador John Herbst. Thank you all for joining us. If you'd like to go to our website, recording will be available and the statement is on our website as well. Thank you again for your leadership, and we will continue to highlight this case. Until next time, thank you very much. Goodbye.